Hi everyone, welcome back. At the end of the last lecture, in which we explicated the new view of property as rights to use an object, we made some interesting points. We said that different people could hold different property rights to the same object at the same time. We said that different people could hold the same property right to the same object at different times. And as a result of this, there was potentially an infinite number of property rights associated with every object, one for each real and potential use of the objects. Some points to note about this view of rights as we've elaborated it. First of them is to note that, indeed, there is potentially an infinite number of rights associated with any particular object, not just the three that are associated with ownership in the old view. So in the older view, we have property rights to possession, property rights to use, property rights to disposition, and those categories are extremely broad. Now property rights are defined much more narrowly in terms of particular individual uses, so there are many, many more of them, and because there are so many more of them, there's many more opportunities to trade them amongst individuals. And indeed, this is one of the reasons that the new view tended to displace the old view, because it was friendlier to commerce and made it possible for people to buy and sell rights to use particular objects in ever finer and more nuanced ways. Finally, to note that the new view, at least as we've discussed it, clearly separates property from objects. That is, the fact that there are so many property rights associated with so many uses over so many different times, potentially stretching infinitely into the future, suggests that it's not the object that's important in property, but each and every one of those individual rights. So, one way to think about them is to think about every object as carrying with it or having associated with it a quiver of rights, as the picture suggests. That is, we can imagine each of the property rights as an arrow, and each arrow is associated with a different use of the object in question, and in principle at a different point in time as well. In the picture, there are just a few arrows in the quiver, but as we've said, when we're talking about property rights, particularly for complex objects like buildings and such, there is a very large number of arrows, and ownership of each of the arrows can be distributed across large numbers of people. So, with this image of rights, property rights, as representing a bundle of arrows or a quiver of arrows, let's ask the final question in this portion of the course. And that is, how are new rights created? I've suggested that there's a different property right for every potential use of an object, and so the question then becomes, how is it that new uses become the subject of property rights, and how are those property rights to new uses of objects, how are those distributed, how are they created, generally speaking? So let me offer an example, and the example comes from one of my favorite cultural artifacts in American history. It's the wonderful television program of the 60s, Star Trek. You'll recall that Star Trek starred Captain Kirk and his hardy crew on the Starship Enterprise, one of whom was Commander Montgomery Scott, who was the chief engineer of the Enterprise, and Scotty was in charge of the transporter machine on the Enterprise. The transporter machine was a machine that enabled people or objects to be transported almost instantaneously from one point in space across vast distances to other points in space. And the way that the machine accomplished this, as you can see in the picture, was to decompose the bodies of the people who were being transported, and then to reconstruct the molecules of the individual's body at the point that had been specified in the machine. So when the machine worked, it would decompose your body into molecules. It would have programmed into it the point where you were supposed to be put back together again, and in a second or two, you would be reconstructed, as it were, in the new place. It was a lovely machine. It figured in many of the adventures of the crew of the Starship Enterprise, and interestingly, it made a great deal of noise when it worked. So when Scotty turned the dial and beamed Kirk down or up from the ship to another planet, it would sound something like this. And then they'd be off and reconstructed wherever it was that their coordinates had specified. So the question now becomes, let's go back to Simone's dormitory room and ask whether indeed Simone has the right to use a transporter machine in her room. And of course, this question doesn't make a great deal of sense at first glance because, of course, there are no real transporter machines. They're just a figment of our imagination, at least until this point. And so, because there is no transporter machine, no one's ever really tried to assert the right to use one in Simone's room. Simone has never tried to use it, nor has anyone in Mike's crew ever tried to use it. Indeed, no one has ever tried to use the machine in her room because there is no such machine. But let's suppose that in the near future, somebody is actually able to construct a transporter machine that operates in the way that I've described, and Simone happens to come into possession of one of these machines and asks to use it in her room. Well, indeed, she doesn't ask. What she does is to simply use it. And when she uses it, as you've seen, it makes that noise. And when it makes that noise, we'll hypothesize Simone's next-door neighbor comes knocking on her door and says, "That machine you're using in there, Simone, it's pretty noisy, and when you use it, it's hard for us to study in our rooms. So would you please refrain from using the machine?" Simone, perhaps wanting to keep good relations with her neighbors, might agree to that, in which case the dispute would be resolved, and Simone might go back and think that she's surrendered her interests to the interests of her neighbors and done that to keep the peace. Alternatively, Simone may decide, well, it's my room. I'd like to use a transporter machine. Let's hypothesize that transporter machines are not illegal. So, without anyone else to tell her that she can't do it, Simone says, "It's my room. I'll use the transporter machine if I like. And if you can't study while I'm using the machine because of the noise, well, generally that's tough." If Simone takes this point of view, then the neighbors may decide to yield. "Well, okay, Simone, we'll recognize your right to do this just to keep the peace." But they too may say, "No, sir, we don't want to submit to this. We expect to be able to use our room in the way that we contracted with Mike to use the room. We expect to be able to study, and Simone, by using the transporter machine, has made it impossible for us to do so." And so what will happen? They'll have to get somebody to say who has the right to use the transporter machine. If Simone gets the right to use the transporter machine, she can use it whether her neighbors object to it or not. But if her neighbors get the right to use the transporter machine in Simone's room, then they can exercise that property right negatively and exclude Simone from using the transporter machine in what would otherwise be her room. How typically do we find out who is the proper owner or the initial owner of the transporter machine right? Well, in the United States, we typically go to a legal authority, as we'll hypothesize in the next lecture, a court. And so we can imagine that courts make decisions to resolve disputes like those between Simone and her neighbors over the operation of the transporter machine over and over and over again. And when those disputes are resolved, the judge makes an authoritative decision either that Simone has the property right to use the transporter machine in her room without the consent or the permission of her neighbors, or alternatively, that the neighbors have the right to keep Simone from using the transporter machine in her room without the permission of the neighbors. We can imagine that the judges have sitting in their chambers a quiver of empty, non-assigned property rights, a quiver of arrows that have no labels on them. But once a decision is made in the dispute between Simone and her neighbors over who has the right to use the transporter machine in Simone's room, the effect of that decision will have been that the judge will have taken one of those arrows out of the quiver in her chambers, put a label on that arrow that says the bearer of this arrow has the right to use a transporter machine in Simone's room, and then the judge, by deciding the case, would have given that arrow, given that property right to one or another of the contesting parties. That's how new property rights are created, and in the next lecture, I'll expand on this idea and suggest a surprising result about the creation of new property rights.